After enough time spent watching MMA, you'll start to realize that very few people actually come out of the sport unharmed. On this list, we'll examine boxers who were headed for an impeccable legacy but whose reputations were damaged before it was all said and done. Without further ado, and in no particular sequence, these are some fantastic MMA careers that ended badly. Jon Jones. In truth, we could make an entire video about how Jon Jones has tainted his near-perfect legacy over the years. As perhaps the single most talented fighter the UFC has ever seen, it would take something truly major for Jon Jones to find a way to cast a shadow over his accomplishments. And yet, somehow, he's managed to do just that. Since the midpoint of his title run, controversy has followed him like few athletes in the sport. From legal issues on the road, substance abuse, PEDs, poking people in the eyes, and even a case of domestic violence. The first thing that springs to mind when most people think of Jon Jones these days is not his many title defenses or his remarkable skills. Nowadays, we generally associate this longtime champion with his lowest moments, and unfortunately, there had been quite a few of them at this stage. Tyron Woodley. Make no mistake, Tyron Woodley is one of the greatest welterweight fighters of all time. An incredibly athletic, methodical, and dangerous fighter who, while splitting fans right down the middle, had a resume that cannot be ignored. But after falling on some hard times in the octagon, losing his last four without winning a single round, his stock fell to another level entirely when he left the UFC. His first fight with Jake Paul, a YouTuber turned boxer, was probably enough to see him earn some of his respect back. But watching him get knocked out in the rematch definitely wasn't a good look for the once great champion. Sadly, Woodley's stock really did take a few hits by the time he hung up his gloves. A legendary fighter, but one who struggled to end on the right note. BJ Penn. If you haven't been properly introduced to this legendary lightweight and welterweight champion, we'd urge you to watch some classic BJ Penn fights as soon as you get the chance. Because these days, he is sadly known more for the latter portion of his MMA career, where he went on a historic losing streak. Beginning in October of 2011, the prodigy would come up short in 7 consecutive bouts, most of which were fairly one-sided. And in that time, we saw this once great fighter slowly lose the magic that made him special. Still, despite the string of defeats and Dana White begging him to retire, Penn was given several chances to recapture his previous form. But after getting knocked out in a street fight in 2019, the UFC had finally seen enough. Sure, he's a legendary Hall of Famer, and a lot of us remember him for his best work. But at this stage, it's hard to ignore his dismal final years. Ben Askren. Ben Askren did not find his way onto this list for any form of PD usage or out-of-octagon controversy. As a former one and Bellator champion, he instead saw his unbeaten prime career tarnished after a string of bad performances and one pretty awful post-UFC appearance. If Ben Askren had stayed retired after his last fight in ONE FC, he'd probably still be seen as one of the greatest fighters to never compete in the UFC. But by the time he arrived under Dana White's banner, things took a turn for the worse. The controversial win over Robbie Lawler soon gave way to one of the most embarrassing coasts in UFC history, the 5-second flying knee to his great rival Georgie Masvidal. An underwhelming performance against Damian Maia would conclude his disappointing UFC run. However, what truly earned him his spot on this list was how he followed it up with a brutal KO defeat to Jake Paul, the very same Jake Paul who would later beat his teammate Tyron Woodley. Sure, he's a bigger star now than he ever was before, but the real question is, what was the cost of achieving that? TJ Dillashaw. People already had a lot of reasons to dislike TJ Dillashaw before he tested positive for EPO. By all accounts, he was a bit of a sore loser, and his tendency to spar with an overcompetitive edge became a problem. So much so that it reportedly led to the early retirement of his ex-teammate Chris Holdsworth. It also left Uriah Faber's team Alpha Male on pretty bad terms, which made him a fairly divisive figure. But when TJ Dillashaw fought and lost to Henry Cejudo at 125 pounds and then tested positive for the banned substance EPO, it wasn't a good look for the longtime bantamweight champion. And sure enough, as much as Che tried to own up to his mistake and come clean, his entire legacy was called into question after that point. Every good story needs a villain, but TJ Dillashaw took that concept to a different level. Sure, there are undoubtedly some things to enjoy about his exceptional career, but we think it's pretty fair to say that he has damaged his legacy quite heavily. Josh Barnett. Josh Barnett has a history of blatant PED usage that few at the top level can rival. Whether he was a particularly bad example or just terrible at concealing it, his multiple failures over the years have overshadowed his many accomplishments. Not only was he stripped of the UFC heavyweight title for this reason, but it also caused him to be pulled from the biggest fight of his career against Fedor Emelianenko, which actually led to the downfall of the Affliction promotion. Sure, Barnett is still loved by fans in spite of his many mistakes, but few fighters have managed to shoot themselves in the foot quite like the former heavyweight champion. A great career in many ways, but also one that should be considered pretty untrustworthy from start to finish. Chael Sonnen. Next up, we had a spot for the bad guy himself, a man who probably handled being caught for PD usage better than anyone else. People still adore Chael Sonnen these days, and given his charismatic personality, it's not hard to see why. However, on 2 different occasions, Sonnen was caught using banned substances by the anti-doping agency once after his loss to Anderson Silva in 2010, where he tested positive for steroids. The other came up in 2014 prior to UFC 175, where Sonnen failed a random drug test, which caused him to temporarily retire. Of course, in true Chael Sonnen fashion, he owned up to what he did. Sonnen had a unique talent of bouncing back from any form of punishment he would receive. After all, he is nicknamed the bad guy, so credit must be given for how true to form he has been. But even with all of that being said, Chael's best moments in the cage have certainly come under some well-deserved scrutiny. Conor McGregor. Like Jon Jones, there's almost a skill to the way that Conor McGregor attracts controversy. In fact, would be more inclined to say that he openly invites trouble, in comparison to Jon Jones, who just keeps attracting it. As the biggest star the sport has ever known, Conor McGregor's best years are still held in high regard by the majority of fans, but his recent troubles, both inside and outside of the octagon, have made focusing on the positives quite difficult. Jumping the cage at a rival promotion's event, gathering up a group of friends and attacking a bus filled with fighters, punching an elderly man in an Irish pub, Conor is just about as notorious as they come. And that's just scratching the surface. With only 1 win in MMA over the last 6 years, it's easier to focus on what's going wrong with the Irish legend than what's going right. The main question we all have now is whether or not he can turn it all around. We're all aware of just how much one big win can affect a fighter's career. But for now, Conor McGregor's legacy is in a tough spot, and he will have his work cut out for him as he prepares for a return to competition. Ronda Rousey. Speaking of superstars with tainted legacies, Ronda Rousey's massive decline has nothing to do with steroids or legal issues. Instead, it has everything to do with how she handled high-profile setbacks, and being a sore loser caused many fans to turn on the global superstar. No single blow landed by either Holly Holm or Amanda Nunes did more damage to Rousey's stock than her inability to accept a loss. Unfortunately, Ronda did irreparable damage to her own legacy by how she reacted in defeat, and it's hard to know if the MMA community will ever fully accept her again. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.